Again, welcome to our program. We'll begin in about 1 minute. For those of you who are listening in to the recording today, there may be some silence for the next moment or two. Please know that you are going to have the opportunity to listen in about 30 seconds. Welcome to Not Everyone Was Raised at Your House. I'm communication skills expert Pamela Jett, and I am delighted that you have chosen to spend your valuable time with us today to discover how to leverage the power of perception to unlock the secrets of better communication, even with those people who sometimes are baffling or who sometimes get on your nerves. Have you ever found yourself thinking as you're interacting with someone, either personally or professionally, who raised them? It might be thinking to yourself, why are they doing that? Don't they know any better? Don't they have any common sense? And while it's sometimes rather embarrassing to admit, I too sometimes think, I shouldn't have to tell you this. You should know this already. You should know better. And there I go, shouldn't on people. And many of you know that that's a poor choice. But so many of us forget that the world is indeed a different place to different people. Many of us forget that not everyone has had the same background, the same experiences. Not everyone has been given the privilege, perhaps, of the same type of parenting that we've been given. Not everyone has had the same role models in their professional career that perhaps we've had. And it can be very frustrating sometimes to communicate with people who are different from us or who we don't understand. And the goal of this program is to help us recognize the role that perception plays, the role that our filters play in our communication, and do what we can to maximize our ability to communicate even when we don't see eye to eye. Now, when I talk about recognizing your filters and your biases for enhanced success, I find it really helpful to imagine that everybody in this world is walking around with their own unique set of eyeglasses. And through those eyeglasses, they both take in information and process information according to their personal prescription. And many of you probably wear eyeglasses, and you know that as your eyes change and you change a prescription, things either go into focus or they come out of focus. The world really is a different place when you change your prescription. Well, the world is full of people who are walking around with different prescriptions. We all see the world a bit differently. We all respond to stimuli differently. We all see the world differently because of our experiences, because of these things called filters and biases. Now, one of the things that I find very helpful anytime I engage in a discussion based around this concept that, not everybody is raised at your house, not everybody has that same prescription going as you do, one of the things I find very helpful is to do a quick review of a basic model of communication. Now, notice I called this a very basic model of communication. There are a lot of different models of communication available. Most of them are much more sophisticated than what you are seeing there on slide number 3. For the sake of this discussion, I'd like to talk about communication from this very basic or simple model. So each person involved in an interaction, and of course we could have an unlimited number of people involved in any communication interaction, each person is both a sender and a receiver. One of the mistakes that I see in a lot of models of communication is that it's a linear model. Like there's one sender and there's one receiver, so someone is sending a message to another person, and so they are the sender and the other person is the receiver, and it's a straight line model. Here's what happens, though. We are simultaneously sending and receiving messages. When I send a message verbally, it's more obvious that I might be sending a message. Even if I am receiving a message, taking in a message, I am also sending a message non-verbally through either eye contact or attentiveness or smiles, my posture, how I'm holding myself, the way I seem to be looking or participating with the speaker. So we are simultaneously sending and receiving messages. That's a very important part of a basic communication model. We simultaneously send and receive. It's also important to note that in a basic communication model, we have to also think of ourselves as both encoders and decoders. Because if I'm experiencing something and I want to share it with you, I need to take that experience, that feeling, that thought, that idea that I have, and I need to use some sort of coding system to deliver that to you. For the vast majority of those of us participating today, that coding system is the English language. And this is happening so easily and so readily and so quickly that most of us don't even realize that we are encoding our thoughts and our feelings using language. But not only does it have to be encoded, it also has to be decoded. And any of you who have ever traveled to a foreign country, you know that if you don't share the same language or the same coding system, it can be very difficult to communicate because you're not able to decode or decipher what the other person is saying and vice versa. We have a shared coding system. But just because we have a shared coding system, if we speak the same language, does not mean that we're going to have crystal clear communication or that our messages will be received the way we intend them. In order to prove this to you today, I'm going to ask that you take a moment and engage in a brief exercise. Now, I recognize some of you might be listening to this as you are driving. Perhaps you've downloaded it. Some of you might be participating with others so that you can talk about this exercise. Some of you might not be able to physically do this exercise, so just imagine doing it in your head. What I'm going to ask that you do is I'm going to ask that you take a very quick moment and draw a dog. Draw a dog, please. Grab a scratch piece of paper, grab a writing utensil, and quickly draw a dog. And again, if you are listening to this while driving or doing something else, just pretend, like imagine, okay, I'm drawing a dog right now. Draw a dog. And take a moment or two and actually engage in this activity. Draw a dog. Now, it's a good guess, by the way, as you are drawing, that almost everyone is understanding the message that I am sending when I say draw a dog, or when you read draw a dog. So here's what I'm going to ask that you do. I'm going to ask you to put the finishing touches on your dog, pencils down, put your pens down, or stop imagining in your head. And I'd like you to compare either your actual dog drawing or the one that you were imagining in your head to that. The dog that we have there on the slide. And I have a strong sense that no one's dog looks exactly like that. In fact, if you are listening with a group of people today and you can show your dog drawing to someone who is seated near you, compare and see, hey, did we draw the exact same dogs? Does anyone have a dog that is looking exactly like the dog here on the screen? And the answer is most likely no. That's because even though we share the same coding system or language, there's a whole lot of room for filters to come into play. So most of you, when I said draw a dog, the first thing you had to do was get a mental picture of a dog in your head. Okay, what does a dog look like? You know it doesn't look like an orangutan or a banana. You know basically what a dog looks like. So we're doing okay with the encoding, decoding up to a point. But what type of dog, what breed comes into play? That's where filters come into play. Whenever we send, as speakers, messages, whenever we send messages as listeners, they have to go through filters. And these filters can really impact the message itself. And these filters can cause a whole lot of communication challenges. Because if I am in a leadership position and I say to someone, hey, I'd like you to get that done ASAP. Most of us probably know that ASAP stands for as soon as possible. And yet, even if we have that shared meaning, that ASAP stands for as soon as possible, one person might interpret that as soon as possible as drop everything and get it done now, and another person might interpret that as when I can get around to it, as soon as it is possible. Well, where do those interpretations come from? They often come from your experiences, and your experiences contribute to your filters, how you tend to filter information, how you prioritize information, how much attention you give to information, and the meaning that you ascribe to the codes that you're receiving. And because not everybody was raised at your house, we don't all have the same filters. Now, here are some common filters. I will tell you before we go through this list of common filters that we could spend an entire semester at a university setting talking about these filters. We clearly do not have the luxury during a webinar to go into that level of detail. So I'm going to talk about each of these very briefly. And as I do, I'd like you to think to yourself, how are these filters impacting the relationships I have with other people, the way I communicate with those that I work with and for, or perhaps even supervise or manage? One common filter is the filter of intention. And I know we've all gone through this before. When we are upset about something, and perhaps it's something that someone did 6 weeks previously, and then the next time we communicate with them, we take what they say as criticism, as an insult, and that's because we have some assumptions about their intentions, and it can color what we hear. And I know we've all experienced that. We've had a previous bad interaction with someone that contributes to how we filter the next interaction. And sometimes we have these intentions in our own head that, you know what, they're going to say something rude. And we just assume what they're going to say is rude, and so lo and behold, anything they say comes out as rude. Beliefs also contribute to our filters. Beliefs about people, beliefs about the nature of work, beliefs about how the world works. By the way, sometimes these beliefs are what are called sometimes meta-programs. That's that last bullet on the list. If they're really big beliefs, like some people believe that the world is a very positive place. Some people believe that the world is a very negative place. Albert Einstein once said that the most important decision that anybody can make in life is to decide whether the universe is a hostile or a friendly place. Well, if you believe that the universe is a hostile place, you're going to start seeing hostility in almost all communication or all messages. But if you believe the universe is a friendly, helpful place, you'll start seeing those friendly, helpful messages. That's what the research teaches us. Many of you have heard me talk about the thing called our reticular activating system. That's where our filters lie. It's part of our brain. And these filters lie in our reticular activating system. And depending on what we believe, we're going to interpret messages in a particular way. It explains, by the way, self-fulfilling prophecies. You know, if you believe you're going to have a bad day, anything that happens to you, you will interpret as, yep, that was bad. And other people can have the exact same experiences, and they won't interpret it as negative or bad at all because they have a different belief system. Very similar to those belief systems are our values. And those values are very powerful. To give you one very simple example, I value time. I value time highly. I value my time, and I value the time of others. That comes to some degree because of how I was raised at my house. My father was a stickler for being on time. You don't want to be late. And it really was ingrained in my brain. So I was raised in a household where time was valued. And if you were late, it was a sign of disrespect, that you didn't value other people. And that stuck with me. I still value time. It's congruent with my personality, and I try very hard to be on time, and I feel badly when I'm not on time. I feel badly when I waste others' time. I get frustrated when it takes too long for things to get done. I value time. And I'll never forget the first time I conducted a workshop in Hawaii. I was told by my local contact, we'll have a lot of latecomers because they run on island time. And I'm thinking, no worries, I've heard of island time before. It's not a big deal, but there was a part of me that was baffled. If a meeting starts at 9, why would people think it's just okay to roll in 9:15, 9:25, 9:30? And about 25% of the audience arrived 15 to 30 minutes late, as if it was no big deal. Now, to me, it was a big deal. But in that culture where they were raised, it wasn't. Now, subsequently, I have done a lot of workshops and a lot of work in Hawaii, and I recognize that it's just more easygoing, more laid back. If you say something starts at 9, it kind of means around 9 o'clock. They don't have that same value system associated with time. And time is just one example of your values. And when other people don't value things the way you value them, it can cause some communication problems. And we think, why are they doing that? How disrespectful, how rude. And what's really coming into play is we may value things differently. Same thing with attitudes, the attitude we take to things. Some people have a very relaxed attitude. Some people have a very positive attitude. Some people have a very pessimistic attitude. That impacts how they experience the world and how they behave in the world. Same thing with memories, which is another way of talking about experiences, what you have experienced before. For example, if all you have ever worked for was a control freak boss, the kind of boss who wants you to double-check everything with him or her, who does not give you a lot of autonomy, who does not give you a lot of authority, who doesn't applaud people when they take initiative. If you work for a boss who is tightly controlling, you might find yourself at your next job, perhaps reporting to a new and different boss, not taking a lot of initiative, always double-checking, always going through and seeking approval from your boss. However, your new boss may not be that way. Your new boss may be much more into you taking the initiative, and they might be thinking to themselves, what is wrong with her? Why doesn't she take some initiative? She doesn't have a lot of backbone. She's not very assertive. She's not much of a go-getter. And the reality of it is because your previous experiences taught you that taking initiative was wrong. It was bad. Your new boss sees it differently. The world really is a different place to different people. Obviously, language impacts our filters as well, and we could go on and on and on. We already talked a bit about those meta programs, those big overarching beliefs that are so ingrained in us that we don't even think twice about them. We're almost completely unaware of them. Some of that has to do with what it means to be good or bad, what's evil and what's not evil. Some of those big meta beliefs are often called meta programs, and we don't even think about it. It simply happens. And by the way, we don't even think about most of these filters. So what does this have to do with communication? Everything, from my perspective. One of my very favorite notions is something I learned from Dr. Wayne Dyer, who many of you are probably familiar with. You see him on PBS all the time. Dr. Dyer will teach us that when you change the way you look at things, what you look at changes. There's the power of perspective. When you change the way you look at things, what you look at changes. So what does this have to do with communication and the fact that not everyone was raised at your house? When we can step back and ask ourselves during perhaps a difficult interaction or during one of those moments when we're thinking, they should know better. I ought not to have to tell them this. That's just common sense. When we can step back and start looking at that interaction or that situation differently as, maybe I assume it's common sense, but perhaps they haven't had the same experiences that I have had. They haven't been raised the way that I've been raised. We can start seeing things completely differently. Nothing, by the way, will drive this home faster than international travel. A couple of years ago, I went to Southeast Asia for the very first time, and I remember seeing entire families on motorbikes, one motorbike carrying 6, maybe even 7 people, and I'm not exaggerating. There'd be 2 adults and several children in various places on laps and strapped on the back and sitting between mom and dad on one motorbike. And my first thought as I saw all these families going on one motorbike was, oh my goodness, aren't they going to get in trouble? Aren't they going to get in trouble? Like, aren't the police going to pull them over because that's so dangerous? Not there. That's a consistent and honored mode of transportation. They don't look at that as dangerous. They look at that as perfectly acceptable form of family transportation, just like we think the minivan is a perfectly acceptable form of family transportation. But my programming said, oh my gosh, they're terrible parents, they're going to get in trouble. And I had to step back and realize, oh, I come from a very different place. I come from a place where minivans are the norm. Here, motorbikes are the norm. And to suspend my judgment and to start looking at the world differently. So here are some tools that we can put into place as individuals to help us to listen when we don't really want to listen, or to communicate more effectively, even with people who we're baffled by, or we think, why are they doing that? Or why are they saying it that way? Or don't they know better? One great tool that I work on regularly, and I'm not always successful. This is one of those instances where I have to remember to take some of my own medicine, is to assume positive intent. Go into almost every communication interaction, assuming that the other party or parties is trying to do the best they can with what they have, or that they are trying to get along with you. Because sometimes we find ourselves going into an interaction with the assumption that they're doing that just to get on my nerves, or here we go again. We all know what that feels like. We see someone's phone number come up on our caller ID or their name pop up on our smartphone, and we think to ourselves, what do they want now? Or here we go again. It is so powerful to assume positive intent, because some people aren't going to express themselves the way you might express yourself under the same circumstances. Some people might choose different words. Some people might engage in a completely different approach, and it can be very difficult sometimes not to take that personally, which leads me to the second bullet, which is Q-tip. Q-tip does indeed stand for quit taking it personally. Sometimes when we interact with people who are baffling to us, who we just for whatever reason do not understand, it can feel like we're being personally attacked how they're communicating. And it can make it very difficult to engage in a productive conversation with them if we are feeling personally attacked. My experience has taught me that most of the time, most people are not doing things intentionally to try to hurt us or to get on our nerves or to pick at us or to push our buttons. Now, there are people who do that, and we call those the bona fide difficult people. But most of the time, even if it feels personal, it's really not about us. It's about them. It's about their values, their beliefs, their priorities. It's about the way they are experiencing the world. And it's very helpful to remember, oh, Q-tip, 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 and I quit taking it personally. And then it's also very helpful to remember the difference between difficult and different from you. And the reason I say this is there are some people in this world who are very difficult. They are manipulative, they are conniving, they are bullies, and they are doing what they do in order to achieve their goals and their objectives. So I am not discounting the fact that many of you may interact with bona fide difficult people and maybe even interact with them on a regular basis. However, I also believe that sometimes we are quick to assume that people are being difficult. We are quick to assume that they are doing that just to get on our nerves. Notice we suspend the positive intent and we take it personally. We assume that they're being difficult when often they're not really being difficult. They're simply different from you. And sometimes we can interact with people who value things differently, proceed very differently, and we forget, hey, they're not doing that to be difficult. They're doing that because, well, that's the way it works for them, or that's the way it's easiest for them. They are different from me. By the way, research teaches us that the people that we get along with the easiest, and notice I didn't say the best, I just said the easiest, we tend to get along with easiest or like people easiest or connect readily with people who are like us. People who we click with and we have that instant sort of connection are often people who have a lot of the same experiences and backgrounds. They might not have been raised in our house, but they might have been raised in our neighborhood. And so we get each other. But when we are dealing with people who are different from us, it can be more challenging. That's why it's so important to change our frame so that we can learn to see things differently and change our perspective and not take things so personally, to remember that some people aren't trying to be difficult, they're simply different from us. And I'd like for you to have at your disposal a handful of what I call frame-changing questions. Before I give you those frame-changing questions, though, let me clarify what I mean by framing. Framing is a basic psychological concept that essentially says this is how we organize the data. So this information comes at us through our filters, so it's already been tweaked a bit through the filters, and then we organize it. We make sense of it. We frame interactions up. And sometimes it is very helpful to change our frame, to start looking at things from a different perspective. So here are some really powerful frame-changing questions that if we think about these, particularly during an interaction with someone who is different from us, it can help us connect with them more readily. One of my favorite frame-changing questions is, what is their real emotion? Like, what are they really going through? Because sometimes people will be angry, but their anger is simply a mask for fear or uncertainty or doubt. And if I can ask myself, what is their real emotion? And it doesn't mean that I say these things out loud. You would never ask any of these frame-changing questions out loud. You would never say to someone that you're communicating with, what is your real emotion? But start thinking, what's really going on with them? What emotions might they be experiencing? Now, you may or may not be accurate with your guess, but the moment you start thinking, what's really going on with them? What is their real emotion? And sometimes their real emotion is exactly what they're conveying, but sometimes when we take a moment and we look at it differently, we might realize, oh, they're not trying to be hurtful, they're just afraid. Oh, that's what's really going on with them. They're afraid. And then it makes it easier not to take things personally. Same thing with the question, what are they afraid of? This has been a life-changing question for me. Anytime I interact with someone who is difficult from my perspective, I have found it very powerful to ask myself, what are they afraid of? Let me give that to you in a real-world context. Imagine that you are in a meeting and you are pitching a proposal. And many of your colleagues are attending this meeting along with perhaps your leader, maybe even some members of the executive committee. It's a very important meeting. And you are pitching your proposal. And one of your colleagues is being very negative. That won't work. That's going to take a lot of time. And your first thought is perhaps, why are they being so negative? Can't they see that there are bigwigs in the room? Don't they have my back? I mean, they've got problems. Can't they talk to me personally? Why do they have to throw me under the bus here? And you might start taking it personally. Before you respond, though, from that personal place to your colleague who is being so negative, it could be wise to stop and ask yourself, what are they afraid of? And chances are, if this is a colleague with whom you interact with on a regular basis or with whom you interact on a regular basis, you're going to be able to take a pretty good educated guess. And it may be that what you're proposing is going to mean a change for them, and perhaps they don't like change. Or perhaps what you are proposing means that they are going to have to speed up the time frame of a project that they're working on, and they don't know if they can do that. Or perhaps they're afraid that if you give this proposal that is going to be so successful that they'll be expected to also come up with proposals equally as powerful, and they're afraid they won't be able to do that. Essentially, they're afraid that you're making them look bad. Now, again, these are just some examples, and they would be an educated guess you would be taking, but the moment you start doing that, what you're doing is you're changing your frame. You're not taking it personally anymore. You're realizing, oh, they're afraid that this is going to be hard for them, and they don't want to fail, so they'd rather just put the kibosh on the project. Now, that does not mean that you're changing their behavior, if you have that great aha moment. But what it does allow you to do is two things. First of all, it helps you not take it personally so that you can stay more calm, cool, and collected and professional during the interaction and during the entire meeting. And the second thing it does is it gives you some information so that you can address their fear. Now, of course, you wouldn't want to do it in a real blatant way. You know, well, Sally, I know you're afraid of change, so let me tell you how this isn't going to be a big change. But you can subtly address their fear because you didn't take it personally. You're able to think of ways to address their fear. This is a powerful question because perhaps in their past, every time something proposed like this happened, they struggled. They haven't had the same experience as you do. It triggers in them some fears. And stepping outside of our current perspective and asking what are they afraid of can be very powerful. And this is powerful in any interaction, personally and professionally. Another great question is, what's an alternate story? Like, is there a different way for me to interpret this? I have a colleague of mine who struggles with interpreting things negatively. He is very pessimistic. And any time something happens and his boss will do something that might be critical or negative towards my colleague, he thinks, oh, I'm being fired. It's, I'm not going to get my promotion. He always goes to a very dark and negative place. And one of the things that I do anytime I talk with him, I say, well, could there be another explanation? What else could be going on? What else is on your boss's plate? Essentially, what's an alternate story? To help him see it differently. We can do the same. What's an alternate story? Here I am getting all upset about something. Is there an alternate story? Is there another way of viewing this? Another great frame-changing question is, what is their ultimate goal? What is it that they're really trying to achieve? Because sometimes we can agree on the goals of a conversation. The way they're getting there or the way they're handling the interaction might be disconcerting or upsetting to us. But if we can step back and say, okay, what's their ultimate goal? What are they really trying to achieve? We often find that their ultimate goal is in alignment with our ultimate goal, and then we're able to use one of those real basic communication techniques of starting from common ground or finding common ground. All of this requires us to be willing to recognize that not everybody was raised at our house. Not everybody is hardwired the way we're hardwired. Not everybody sees the world the way we see the world. Not everybody is going to respond in a situation the way we would respond. And if we can change our frame around some of those situations, it can help us communicate and connect more effectively. So speaking of communicating and connecting more effectively, here are some great responses or some communication tools that we can use to get better, clearer information from others. Essentially, here are some great communication tools that we can use even if we're dealing with people who, well, quite frankly, baffle us. One technique is a technique called reflective listening. Sometimes this is also called perception checking. And it's a way of seeing, hey, are we drawing the same dog? Do I understand you correctly? But it's a way of doing it without putting people on the defensive. And it might sound something like this. If I understand you correctly, you are saying, and then you paraphrase back to them what you believe they're trying to say. Or, you know, if I get what's going on correctly, what you're telling me is, or what I hear you saying is. So it's paraphrasing back to the other person your understanding of what they're communicating. Now, the temptation, by the way, is if we didn't get it correctly, they might say, no, I didn't say that, and that can trigger defensiveness in us. Well, that's what you said. Remember, it's more important in these kinds of situations to gain an understanding. So if they weren't clear, you simply say, oh, okay, well, help me to understand. Tell me more. You ask another probing question, or you ask a clarifying question instead of taking the bait and saying, well, you said, because that's what tends to happen. We say, if I understand you correctly, you're saying X, Y, and Z, and they say, oh, no, I didn't say that. Oh, yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't, which, of course, isn't very productive. Another great communication technique to add to your repertoire, and remember, these are things that you might already be doing. You simply want to do more of them, especially if you're dealing with someone who may have different background, different experience, come from a different culture, come from a different type of family system, have different work experience that you do, maybe even someone who works in a different department or on a different team. Ask open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are different than a yes or no question or a one-answer question. So instead of saying, did you get the report done, it would be, hey, what's the status of the report? Or, you know, what's up with the Jones report? Ask, how would you solve this? What would you recommend we do? What do you believe the next steps ought to be? Ask people open-ended questions, because the more open-ended questions you use, the more information you're going to get from them. And the more information you get from them, the more you can understand, oh, now I get what it was like in their house, so to speak. We get more insight into how they're functioning and what their thoughts are. I also believe that it's important to master the technique of boundary statements. And we're going to talk about boundary statements in a bit more detail at a later segment of this program. But for now, recognize that boundary statements can be very useful when a conversation starts to go off the rails or when things don't tend to stay on track or on the subject. We can use boundary statements. But speaking of getting more information or better information from others and communicating more effectively with others, I'd like to remind you about something that you perhaps have been exposed to in a previous workshop with me, or perhaps you have learned it from another resource, and that has to do with communication styles. One of the biggest barriers to great communication tends to be style. Everyone has their own communication style, and sometimes it's very difficult to understand and respect people whose styles are very different from ours. Now, part of this communication style piece comes from how people were raised, how they were taught to communicate. Part of it is also simply how they are born. It's that nature and nurture. So it's their natural style coupled with how they were raised can create a communication style that they use personally and or professionally. Now, there's tons of research on communication style, and we could spend, as I mentioned earlier, another university semester talking about communication styles. But the research reveals that there are 4 basic styles out there, and many of you have gone through Myers-Briggs testing, or you've done the colors, or you have done the DISC profile. They all pretty much are the same thing, and they all boil down to these 4 basic styles. So as I talk you through these very briefly, I'd like you to think about what your primary style might be, and also think about someone that perhaps you struggle with and think what their primary style might be. Some people are what we call fast-paced people priority people. They walk fast, they talk fast, they think fast. Everything they do is fast, and they're very people-oriented. They like people. They like to be around people. People matter to them. They're often very creative. They're often very fun-loving. They often are very energetic or extroverted. They can be the life of the party. They are multitaskers. They're not always great with the details, by the way. These are the people for whom overdraft protection was invented. They're very fast-paced and people-oriented. In contrast to that, we find our fast-paced task priority people. They walk fast, they talk fast, they think fast, but they're also very get to the point, don't waste my time, bottom line, get the job done kinds of people. They can be fairly direct in their communication, and sometimes they can hurt other people's feelings because they're so direct, because they're so focused on getting the job done. Now, we all sometimes can see ourselves in each of these styles, depending on our circumstances. However, when we're glaringly honest with ourselves, we realize that one style is typically more representative for us than others. And for me, this fast-paced task priority style, that's me. That's where I fall. I am very, get to the point, don't waste my time, bottom line. I can be very direct in my communication. Sometimes I can be aggressive. I don't want to be. I try to stay assertive. I very rarely am passive. I tend to say it, to spit it out. I want you to rip the bandage off quickly. I don't like it when people beat around the bush, when people hem and haw. Indecision drives me bonkers. Make up your mind and do it. When people don't take initiative, it is hard for me. It's like, take some initiative, have some backbone. And so sometimes that style of being fast-paced and task-oriented can be in stark contrast to the slower-paced people priority people. These are people who are more mellow, more easygoing, more flexible. They're very people pleasers. They like to be nice all the time. And that doesn't mean, by the way, if your style is something other than this slower-paced people priority, that you're not nice. But these people don't ever want to rock the boat. They don't want to ever upset anybody. They always want to be nice. They're peacekeepers because, well, people matter to them. They don't want to rock the boat. They hate conflict. They also have a hard time taking initiative and making decisions because they don't want to make the wrong decision. They want to please other people. They want to be accepted by the group. So fast-paced task priority people can sometimes drive slower-paced people priority people up a tree, and vice versa. Slower-paced people who are priority people are thinking, or people priority, often think fast-paced people are being demanding and domineering, and all fast-paced people are trying to do is just get the job done. And fast-paced task priority people can sometimes get frustrated with these slower-paced people priority people because of their indecision. And they're not trying to be indecisive. They just want to make sure that they make the right decision. I'm sure you can see as we talk about this how this could cause some clash. And then finally, we have our slower-paced task priority people. These are people who they are very deliberate, very linear, very logical. They are very much get the job done. They aren't really people. They're never the life of the party. Small talk is hard for them. They can be very nice. They can be very kind. They can be very pleasant, but they aren't necessarily the life of the party. They are more, just let me go in my office and shut the door and work. They like to work by themselves. They love details. They love logic. They love to be analytical, and they like to do it at their own pace. They hate change because if they have to change things, then they have to change their system, and that's really hard for them. And many of you can probably guess that fast-paced people priority people can sometimes clash with these slower-paced task priority people. Because fast-paced people, they're fine with, guesstimate, wing it. That absolutely freaks out a slower-paced task priority person. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we could spend hours and hours talking about these concepts and asking ourselves what's our primary style. And I would imagine that most of you listening, even though I've given you a very brief overview of these styles, have a strong sense, at least of what you're not. Most of us can at least know, well, I'm either fast-paced or I'm not, or maybe I'm a people person or I'm not. Most of us can at least lop two of them off the list. We might wonder, hey, am I a fast-paced people person or a fast-paced task person? but you might know, yeah, I'm fast-paced no matter what. There's no right or wrong style. No style is the right style, but it can be very challenging when we interact with people who have a different style, which is what has led me to think about this superstar tip. This is something I learned from Dr. Tully Alessandra. I learned it when I was in university, probably my sophomore, junior year of college. And I remember being exposed to these personality styles, and I quite frankly didn't like my style. I was like, I don't want to be that, because I didn't want to be the weaknesses that I saw in that style. But I recognize that all styles have strengths and weaknesses, and I know I can't change my style, nor can I change someone else's. I can be the best version of my style possible. Doesn't mean I can't change. It's just that I'm going to be a fast-paced person. But I know I need to sometimes slow down. I can adjust and adapt my style so that I can do unto others as they need done unto them. To communicate, to behave, to treat other people, not in the way that we would want to be treated, but the way they would want to be treated. Which means that as a fast-paced, task-oriented person, if I'm dealing with a slower-paced people person, sometimes I need to slow down. Sometimes I need to give them time to think, and I don't need to take it personally when they can't give me an answer right on the spot, nor do I need to assume that they are stupid or that they are indecisive simply because it takes them longer to process. That is one of the most eye-opening things in the world, is to realize, hey, not everybody is hardwired the way I'm hardwired. And just because they are different from me doesn't mean that they are less valuable or that they have less to offer. In fact, imagine an organization that was run only by fast-paced, task-oriented people, and they had nobody else on their employee roster. A lot of competitiveness, a lot of headbutting. That would be a very difficult organization. Probably a lot of turnover because people wouldn't want to stay. They wouldn't feel valued. They wouldn't feel appreciated. But also imagine an organization run by slow-paced people. Decisions wouldn't get made. They'd do things that were nice, not necessarily the best for business. We need all kinds of people within our organization, but it also means that we sometimes have to step back and say, okay, they weren't raised the way I was raised. They aren't hardwired the way I'm hardwired. That doesn't mean that they don't have something to offer. I simply want to communicate the way they need me to communicate. For example, slow-paced, task-oriented people, they would like you to put things in writing, whereas your fast-paced, people-oriented people, they'd like to talk about it. Which one's right? Neither. So if I'm working with someone who is a fast-paced people person, I'm going to talk to them face-to-face. Somebody else, I might put it in writing. Doesn't mean I'm changing who I am. Doesn't mean I'm changing my message. It simply means that I'm adapting and adjusting because I'm recognizing that, hey, not everybody's like me. Not everybody was raised at my house. So here are a few more communication strategies for those who, well, quite frankly, weren't raised at your house, for those people who are a bit of a mystery. Here are some tips to gather more information when the speaker is unclear, at least unclear from your point of view. Ask probing questions. We talked about that earlier as open-ended questions. You also can say things such as, well, how long have you felt that way? Or what can you tell me specifically doesn't seem to work for you? Or what examples can you provide for me so I can understand better? Or if they say, hey, that's going to cost too much money, help me to understand how much money is too much money. Just ask probing questions. Use reflective listening, which we talked about earlier, that notion of, okay, if I understand you correctly, you're saying X, Y, and Z. Use encouragers. Encouragers are really helpful, especially if you're dealing with people who don't communicate verbally easily. Some people really have a hard time figuring out the words to use. Sometimes it's because they have a limited vocabulary. Sometimes it is because their brain simply doesn't encode as quickly as your brain encodes. So they sometimes have a hard time spitting it out. They have a hard time putting it into words or finding the right words. With those people, encouragers are powerful. Encouragers come in nonverbal and verbal forms. Verbal encouragers are things like or just those real casual noises. Nonverbal encouragers are head nods, smiles. What you don't want to do is the hand gesture of, come on, pick up the pace, or the nonverbal, okay, I got it, or spit it out. Those, of course, are discouragers. But when you're dealing with someone who is slower paced in terms of encoding, using encouragers can be very powerful. By the way, a probing question can be an encourager. Tell me more, or, ooh, that's interesting, I want to know more about that. Those are encouragers. I would also recommend that in this day and age, when we spend so much of our communication time and energy in email, in text messaging, and IMing and pinging each other and so forth, that we are comfortable picking up the phone. So many times we will be in an email conversation that then turns into some sort of epic miscommunication battle, and we get our feelings hurt, and we think that they're yelling at us because they're using all caps, and that's not their intent, but because that's what it comes across the screen as, we tend to take it personally, and now we're offended, and then we take everything personally that they keep writing to us. We all know what that's like, to have a conversation in email or in text message or pinging or what have you that goes off the rails. If you find yourself back and forthing more than 2 or 3 times in email, and there seems to be some miscommunication, or you're finding yourself saying, perhaps I've not been clear, or, hey, let me give you more information, pick up the phone. What a novel concept. Walk to somebody's office. Have a face-to-face interaction if possible, or at least a voice-to-voice interaction, because we get so many cues non-verbally when we are either in someone's presence physically or we are hearing their voice physically. Those are cues and clues that we do not get in email. Pick up the phone. And by the way, here's one of my absolutely favorite probing questions. That's interesting. Tell me more. That's a great way to get people to give you more information. It's also a really great thing to say when you don't know what to say, when you're kind of buying some time, or when you're asking yourself those internal questions of what are they afraid of, or what's their ultimate goal. You're trying to change your own frame so you don't take it personally. That's interesting. Tell me more is a really great way to get more information from them and buy yourself some time so that you can choose your words wisely, so that you can respond professionally or respond in a way that is consistent with your values and your character if we're talking about a personal relationship. And speaking of being able to respond in a way that is consistent with your professional image and what you want to accomplish as a human being, it's important for us to also stop sabotaging our own communication success. So on slide 17, you will see a handful of words to lose. These are words and phrases that almost always trigger in other people defensiveness, hostility, or animosity. And they're also a sign sometimes that we aren't respecting that they may have been raised in a different house or that they see the world differently. For example, the word should. The moment I say to someone, you should do it this way, I'm essentially saying it's my way or the highway. I'm right, you're wrong. And it is very disrespectful. Instead of saying should, we can try I would highly recommend, or I would encourage you to, or even, please do it this way. But shoulding on people is a very poor choice. But I also encourage you to stop saying I disagree and change I disagree to I see it differently. Again, that's the language of respect. Because I disagree is saying I'm right and you're wrong. I see it differently says, hey, we're raised in different houses. We see the world differently. Doesn't mean I'm right. Doesn't mean you're wrong. It's just we see it differently. Watch out for calm down, because it never works. You don't say calm down and people they don't ever calm down. When you say you make me, that's verbal finger pointing, and it'll typically trigger defensiveness. Same thing with I'm sorry if you feel that way. Try replacing the word if with that. I'm sorry that I hurt your feelings, or I'm sorry that I said something disrespectful, instead of I'm sorry if you feel that way. Watch out for you don't understand, because the moment you say to somebody you don't understand, what you're doing is you're devaluing their attempt at empathy. It's also important that you watch out for I understand. Now, of course, In normal conversation, saying to someone, I understand, can be very positive. But if we're using it during a tough conversation, I understand. First thing people are thinking is, no, you don't. You haven't been in my shoes. You don't know what it's like. So it's a phrase to use only with caution. Same thing with I know just how you feel. Often people, when you say I know just how you feel, are thinking, no, you don't. You weren't raised in my house. You didn't experience what I experienced. Now, these are some basic communication tools to stop using. We talk more about these tools in other workshops. However, I would have been very remiss today if I didn't give you some of these words to lose. And that way, we set ourselves up to communicate with respect. Because as you may recall, as I talked about why we ought to stop using some of those words and phrases, it's so that we can be respectful. Respectful even to people who are different from us or bona fide difficult. So here are some reminders on how to communicate with respect to even the most difficult. First of all, remember the difference between being difficult and being different. Sometimes we assume they're being difficult when really they're different from us. They're different in their communication style. They're different in their experiences. It's also important to remember the difference between being right and being effective. Sometimes in our communication we get so hooked into being right, and we have a hard time recognizing that it is more important to be effective than right. And I struggle with this. This is one of my personal bugaboos. I like to be right. Everybody likes to be right. And sometimes the wisest thing to do is to just zip it or to use I see it differently as opposed to I disagree. That's a more effective statement. I disagree is more I'm right, you're wrong statement. It's also important to recognize the difference between response and reaction. When we respond to people who weren't raised at our house, that means we are making choices about what we'll say, choices about how we will interpret what they're saying, that we are not reacting to them. Because when we react to someone or something, we give them the power and control. We allow them to push our buttons. And if I want to be more successful overall as a communicator, I'm going to work on responding. And speaking of responding, here's one of the best ways to respond to people who are really bona fide difficult. They've crossed that boundary from different to difficult, and they are engaging in inappropriate communication. I promised earlier that we would talk about boundary statements. And my favorite boundary statement is, this is important, I want to talk about it, not this way. And boundary statements have three key parts: acknowledgement, willingness, conditionality. Acknowledgement, this is important, or, oh, this is a serious issue. Anything that essentially says to someone, I get it, without saying, well, I understand, this is important, or this is a serious issue. Then your willingness to talk about it. I want to talk about it, or I'd like to resolve this, or I'd like for us to be able to come to an agreement, or I'd like to be able to fix it. Not this way. Those are the conditions, not while they're yelling or not while they are using foul language, not this way. This is a great way of drawing a line, because you cannot punish someone for crossing a boundary that you haven't drawn, for crossing a line that you haven't drawn. But it's not aggressive, it's not inappropriate. Hey, this is important, I want to talk about it, not this way. And they will learn very quickly that their difficult behavior does not work with you. Not everyone was raised at your house. Not everyone sees the world the way you see it. Not everyone has the same communication style. Not everyone has the same experiences, backgrounds. Not everyone has your same values and beliefs and those filters that come into play. And we didn't even talk about the filters of age and gender and so many of those other filters that come into play. So many of us forget that not everyone sees the world the way we see it. You're now better equipped to communicate even with those people who, well, weren't raised at your house. I would encourage you, if you've not done so before, to take some time to social network with me. You can see that there's a good opportunity for you to find me on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, and visit my resource store where you can find some wonderful resources to reinforce some of the things you're learning in these webinars. But also invite you to join us for our next information-packed webinar, which is all about how to give effective performance feedback. Research tells us that leaders have a hard time having those conversations. They don't want to have those conversations. They lay awake at night wondering, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And I'm going to give you some tools to make those conversations easier on Thursday, June the 12th. And you can register today at my website. You'll also be receiving some information via email. I also encourage you to listen to today's program again. You'll receive a download within probably 72 hours, most likely within the next 24 to 48 hours. You can replay the slides. You can listen again. You can process information at your own pace and learn repeatedly. It has been my pleasure to share these tools with you today. I'm communication skills expert Pamela Jett. Our program has ended. You may now disconnect.